the assumption that there are people in the room who weren't here 10 minutes ago or yesterday. Here's members of our gender panel here. Dr. P.Z. Myers of Pharyngula fame, a columnist for Free Inquiry magazine run by the Center for Inquiry, and all-around awesome, famous person. You have Natalie Reed, who, like PZ, writes for Free Thought blogs and got her start on Skeptic and also maintains the Queereka network, a skeptic blog network with an LGBTQ focus, quite unique in its role. You have Vyckie Garrison of No Longer Quivering, a support group for victims of spiritual abuse, such as that perpetrated by the Quiverfull and similar Christian dominionist movements. And we have my favorite person in the universe, Ania Bula, a biologist, English, psychology turning medicine interested person who maintains a blog on social justice, feminism, atheism, etc., and also lets me write about politics for some reason.
He's good at it.
I shall not deny any of this. Anyway, let the questions commence.
So I'll be your moderator for this talk. I'm going to crib from Chris Hevern and simply say, sorry, wrong Chris. So please, one question only. Two questions are not one. This statement is not a question. And we'll just go from there.
Cricket, cricket. It's really quiet in here. It's okay. I think we're getting somebody walking over to the... There are no stupid questions, to quote my father. Yeah, I know there are.
So this is a question, I guess, for Natalie and Ania. Just from the two talks and also just other people I've spoken to, it seems like there's a fair amount of conflict within the feminist community on sort of what the right direction should be. So as someone who's kind of a cisgendered masculine male, how can I sort of go into a foray into this discussion safely?
Are we really that scary? No, there's differences. I'm going to start this one just because the mic was closer to me and because I'm domineering like that. But feminism, like a lot of other movements, obviously has some differences within it. I mean, we see big differences even within the atheist and the skeptics movement. So it's not really that surprising that feminism as well has that. For me personally, my definition of feminism has always been anyone who fights for equal rights. And if you're a cis male, white, privileged, all of that list of stuff that you mentioned, one of the best ways to go about it is to talk to people about it, to talk to women, and to read as much as you can, and basically just think about the issues. As skeptics, we like to say, question everything. Well, the same thing. When you find yourself thinking a certain way about a situation that pertains to gender, question it. Question where your thoughts are coming from. If your first thought, is one of, oh, hey, well, then maybe it's time to stop and think, okay, why am I being defensive right now? And like I said, talk to people, talk to women, talk about what their experiences have been in times when they've been made to feel uncomfortable for being women, or situations and how they can help. And sometimes even just asking the questions can be helpful.
Well, my first reaction is just that I don't think that entering into those spaces or into those discussions should be safe. It's a complex and very difficult issue, and it pertains to a lot of things that really do matter and really do affect people, really do affect all of us. So if your principal motivation is to go in there and be popular and make friends and have everything be safe, then I'd sort of question whether the motivations are really what they need to be. In order to do feminism or transfeminism or any kind of discussion pertaining to power imbalances at all, you sort of have to be willing to get your hands dirty and take risks. But that said, like Anya was saying, definitely if you're coming from the position of relative privilege, the focus should always be to listen or take your cues from whichever group you're supposedly working on behalf of, rather than to go in and sort of say what your opinions are. Like, here's my white opinions on race. Like, let me tell you all about how I feel as a male assigned person for what it's like to be born women. Like, it's that's not cool. So yeah, just listening, taking cues, and have your motivation to be genuinely helping out.
Don't assume anything. Sorry, going off of just even that, you must know what it's like thing. Don't assume anything, because even just from one person to the next, their experiences might have been completely different. And so the perspectives of one person might be drastically different from the perspectives of the person next to them. And making mistakes, I don't want to say it's okay, because usually mistakes end up being something that's transphobic, homophobic, femphobic, sexist. But at the same time, if you make a mistake, and they will be made, I've made mistakes, and I'm willing to admit this. I've made mistakes when it comes to trans issues, when it comes to gay issues, even when it comes to sexist issues. Don't let your automatic reaction be to be defensive. When somebody tells you you're wrong, try to find out why they think that way and be open-minded about it. Don't automatically just try to defend yourself, because if somebody stops and says, okay, yeah, you're being kind of a misogynist, don't immediately try to defend yourself. It's like, well, I have friends who are women. I'm going to steal a little bit from Ian Cromwell's talk. If somebody starts off this, like, I'm not a misogynist, but yeah, if you've heard his talk, you know where that's going. But if you do make a mistake and somebody calls you on it, try to listen openly and try to understand that by pointing out your mistake, we're not trying to attack you, but we're trying to keep you from attacking us too. And unless we have a helicopter, that still was an awesome graphic. And if you make a mistake for it, make up for it, move on. Does anybody else have anything to say? Okay.
There's a scene in the Spike Lee film, the Malcolm X film that Spike Lee directed, where Malcolm is walking through a college campus somewhere, and a young, blonde, white girl comes up to him and says, I've been listening to what you're saying, and I really want to help. Is there any way that I can help make your movement, help you in any way? And he just looks at her and says, no, and walks away. This is reflective of his sort of ideology that problems within communities have to be solved by the members of those communities, and that there's no role for people in the majority who are part of the oppressive group to, it is not only is it not their job to, but it is not their place to solve problems that are faced by an oppressed group. And I was wondering if I could get the panel's opinion on what role you see cis men playing, white men playing in the discussion of feminism, especially when, as you've noted, Ania, there is that these issues affect us as well.
I recently saw this thing, like a Time magazine list of the 100 greatest villains of film culture, and they actually listed Malcolm X from Spike Lee's Malcolm X as one of the greatest villains of film culture. Thought that was incredibly racist and hilarious. Anyway, so I recently wrote this essay just a couple weeks ago called 5 Ways That Cis Feminists Can Help Improve Trans... I don't know what my own titles are. But yeah, it was some way to, 5 ways cis feminists can help out with trans stuff. And I found out a week later, I saw this circulating around Tumblr. It had been excerpted by a cis feminist, taking the headings from each of the 5 things, cutting out the rest of my article, and then posting it without crediting me or sourcing me. She just sort of put it up as her own ideas. So that was definitely something to not do when trying to help out. Just stealing people's ideas and taking credit for it. But basically the points I was trying to make is about sort of paying attention to how and why you're trying to include and help. Are you sort of tokenizing people in when and where you ask them to be included, and are you sort of what do you consider to be a trans issue versus non-relevant and things like that? I think that the crux of it is really about, it's sort of a lot about what the actual motives are. And I think it actually relates to the previous question there, that it's, I think one of the main things is, are you going in there to sort of make yourself feel better about it, or are you going in there to improve the situation? Are you going in there to get that group to feel better for you, or to improve your perceptions in relationship to that group? Or are you going in to ask them what they want you or want from you? And I think as long as you're like as long as you're asking that question, then you're sort of, because it's not an overarching answer. Like any individual, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual contextually different situations. And I think you just need to sort of ask and pay attention and focus on each of those contexts, and always remember to take your cues from whoever you're supposedly helping, and make sure that you're actually trying to help, not simply nominally trying to help.
I don't want this to end up just being where it's just like just me and Natalie talking. Hopefully somebody will pop in and say something else soon. But I think one aspect of it too to remember is that when you're dealing with an issue in which cultural, societal ideas are part of what's causing the problem, just changing, and I mean, it's funny because, we talk about women as a minority group, but if you look at actual population, I mean, women make up 50% at least of most populations. So when that happens, you can't fix the solution by just changing the opinions of 50% of the group. If every single woman stands up and says, yes, I'm awesome, it's still not necessarily going to solve anything if there's still 50% of people saying, no, you're not, know your place. And so it is important for men to get involved in the issue as well. But when they're vocal, it's important that they're taking their cues for women. And I've seen this happen before too, which I find to be hilarious but also annoying, is when you get a discussion going about gender issues and there's the men on the panel who are actually talking over the women in the panel. And
So bad about that?
like, geez, nobody can hear me over him right now. But this happens a lot too. You're talking about gender issues, and you're talking about feminism, and you're talking about the oppression of women in our culture and femphobia, and you have these men who are actually silencing women in their attempt to be so loud about how they support women. And it's this really funny situation because you're standing there saying, okay, you want to support me? Shut up! Please. But so I mean, it's important to talk about these issues if you're a man too, and to try to get as many ideas as you can. But just remember not to talk over the people you're supposedly lifting up, because if you're suppressing them, you're really not helping people. And I mean, one way for men to sort of get involved in this too is to help, spearhead campaigns that help with that. Yes, spearhead. Let's talk about gender and phallic stuff in normal conversation. But even just talking about stuff. There was an interesting article I read just this week that was sent to me by somebody actually at CFI with regards to menstruation, and this professor trying to break the taboo of menstruation by having her students do a project. And one of the things that they did is the men in the class actually created these buttons that say "Real men buy condoms," not condoms, tampons. Real men buy tampons. I'm sorry, I'm a little out of it. And, they got men on campus to do this, and it was basically trying to do that. Well, when we talk about rape culture, wouldn't it be great if we had men, who started making buttons that say, real men don't rape, or real men think consent is sexy, and do this and shift the focus of what it happens and shift it away from, definitions of masculinity being, aggressor, whatever, to being someone who listens, someone who, maybe does things that are classically associated with femininity, and break that taboo of femphobia.
Just one quick thing. I find I'm usually a lot better at saying what not to do than actually saying what to do. But I was just remembering that a few days ago I heard about this article where this a cis hipster art student guy. He dressed in women's clothes for a week, then walked around and like wrote this big blog about like, oh, and like, you know, really wasn't treated that bad. Like the first day I got like a venti latte for free. It was amazing. And like, the thing is, he wrote this, you know, this huge article, and then it got like 45,000 hits, got on like front page of Reddit everywhere. People were like sending it to me saying like, look, I'm learning about trans issues, praise me. And the thing is that when he wrote this thing, he didn't cite or credit or link or reference any of like the past 60 years of like gender variant people writing about how we've been treated and how we get like beaten up and murdered and stuff. And like, he just ignored that. And so I think that just if you're going to be stepping into that conversation, at least do the courtesy of trying to make space for the other voices. Like point out that there are that whoever you're trying to help has been talking about it themselves too. Like just on Transgender Day of Remembrance on November 20th, I've been involved in an ongoing discussion about how the overwhelming majority of victims of transmisogynistic violence are trans women of color, as opposed to white trans women or trans men in general. And so it seems like it's become a really exploitative thing because we sort of don't really talk about that distinction, just say trans people are getting murdered, pity me. And so instead of writing my own article on it, I decided I was just gonna like, you know, I'm just gonna shut up for once and just like link some stuff that trans women of color are actually saying about this, instead of stepping forward and directing attention to me, because that would be kind of an uncool way to approach it.
Actually talk, because when you were asking your question, you know, coming from my perspective as somebody who for a lot of years identified as an anti-feminist, I embraced the term patriarchy. I thought that was a good thing because of the fundamentalist cult that I had been involved in. And ironically, the person who was able to help me to rethink that and to get out of that was my uncle, who is a cis male. You know, and when we began our correspondence together, writing back and forth, the thing that you know, I think if he would have come at me as, you know, I can see that you are in this really weird headspace and you need some help, I would have resisted that. But instead, he just wanted to be my friend. He just wanted to get to know me, and he started, you know, asking me, you know, he says, I can see that you are a deliberate and intentional person. I like the countercultural nature that you obviously have embraced. You know, not saying that he approved of my lifestyle, but saying that he at least, you know, appreciated that I wanted to be different. I wanted to go, you know, against the flow. I was, you know, thinking about what I was doing and why. And so he's like, can you just explain some of this to me? And it was that opportunity. It was not an attacking or a condemning, but it was showing an actual interest in me, why I thought the way I did, why I behaved the way I did, and just taking an interest in actually wanting to be a friend gave me that opportunity to start rethinking and going, why am I doing this? And through that process, you know, it's not like he was just feeding me information and saying, you know, here's why you're wrong, but by having that relationship, building that friendship, gave me an opportunity to say, yeah, this is kind of weird. So.
Please don't use the words feminism is no longer needed. That is one of the things that pisses me off the most. And I've had people, like I've had professors tell me in science classrooms that women aren't meant to study science. I've had this happen, and I'm 25. Like, I'm young enough that this shouldn't be happening. Like, our culture supposedly has changed all this way, but I had that happen. In high school, when I took, you know, biology, physics, and chemistry, I had my guidance counselor take me and ask me if I was sure I could handle the heavy load. And there was 5 other people in the school doing that, and they were men, and I hadn't seen a single one of them called into the counselor's office to talk about this. And I asked her point blank, are you going to ask any of the men this question? And the fact that she stopped talking and let me go back to class kind of spoke pretty loudly about that. And I mean, it happens a lot. And I mean, even just this past week, or it was 2 weeks ago, that friend, who said, I can't argue with you because you're too emotional. And it's just kind of like, I'm quoting articles that I've read. I've quoted studies that I'm reading, but I'm saying it in a loud tone of voice and passionate because that's what I am. And because you're wrong, you're going to completely degrade everything I'm saying by choosing to paint it as emotion rather than passion. Pardon? And facts. And yes, and what I was saying was fact. Next question. It's okay, I know her.
There we go. So, I don't know if you've been in a toy store recently, last 20 years, but you have a boy aisle, you have a girl aisle, and ne'er the twain shall meet. And, even bed shopping, you have boy beds, you have girl beds, you have boy clothes, you have girl clothes. How do you raise kids in that environment so that they can still know that they can make choices and that there is a range beyond that?
As a mother of 7, I can talk a lot about my kid.
Pardon? Yes. Oh, no, sorry.
Apparently nobody knows. I don't know. I know that Harrods in London recently stopped doing the boy-girl thing, and they have theme organizations, like dolls, stuffed animals, Lego kits. But then Lego kits are now Lego Friends versus, the Lego Friends, the pink little lavender Lego for girls. So I don't know. There's some stores that are getting better in that regard, but obviously it's still sort of the way it is. I have no idea. I think that I do sometimes get asked actually by cisgender readers who have kids who are sort of behaving in gender variant ways or expressing some curiosity or exploration in gender. Usually the response I give is to just give them space to sort it out. Don't yourself participate in that enforcement. And sometimes, and I also advise giving them a chance to explore it, asking them on different days, do you feel like a boy today or do you feel like a girl today? And not just taking one answer as the given, but to ask over and over and allow it room to grow and develop. But I'm not a mom, and I just don't have the firsthand experience to really speak very much to it. I'm sorry. But I know people who do.
As the father of 3. Yeah. If I were the father of 8, we'd still say lightweight. Yes, so it's no problem. There's a theme that I've been hearing here. It's shut up and listen. Do that with your kids too. There's no reason you as a parent have to impose on them your expectations of what they will do. So we asked the kids, they'd tell us what they wanted. My daughter grew up, she wanted things like Legos and music, not the gendered Legos, the old, right. And that's what we'd go for, is what were they interested? Let them pursue their own interests. And yes, you may find that sometimes your daughter is interested in classically feminine toys, and that's okay. Let her. And my son, I remember, was very attached to a teddy bear for many years. No problem. That's what they want. Let them do it.
Do you have something to say? I don't. Okay. I'll take a stab at it, but and this is really funny too because I happen to know that you're a parent, so I'm. So it's funny for me just hearing this where it's I'm not. And I think it's important to make sure, yes, they're going to see a lot of this stuff in society, but to try to make sure they don't necessarily see this stuff at home. So one thing that I didn't talk about was, roles at home. And, usually it's the, woman who takes care of, the household chores, and it's the father who takes, who does stuff outside of the thing or anything that's hands-on and that kind of stuff. And it's okay to have that dynamic at home, but also to not necessarily make that the dynamic because of gender roles. Like in my own relationship with my partner Alex, he actually does more of the household chores than I do, like to a crazy degree. Thank you for that, honey. But I also, whenever there's stuff that needs to be built or whatnot, I end up doing it. So it ends up being this kind of funny situation. And it's just important to be aware of that. And like Natalie said, ask them how they're feeling that day. And, maybe every once in a while, buy them toys that might fall outside of the scope and let them discover them. Don't, force them on them, but let them discover them. Buy your son a doll and see if he likes it. Or, yeah. Not that Barbie is always a thing. A funny thing about that too is it's funny how many stores even that aren't toy stores anymore are falling into that too. I have a rant on my blog actually when I walked into a Chapters and I saw this table set up, books for her. And the stuff on there was like the fluff reading, like Confessions of a Shopaholic and that kind of stuff. And then there was a bunch of books on woo too, like alternative medicine, homeopathy, that kind of stuff. And I'm looking at that going, what? No. And I've never really gotten that angry about stuff where it says like for her, for him, until I got to that moment and I saw that and I just got so angry and I went off on this rant. And I'm like, replace her with like any other kind of oppressed minority and people would be up in arms. Could you imagine if we walked into a Chapters and had a books for blacks section? Holy crap! I would love that. Would you? Well, yeah, but it was just, or even worse, if that section was filled with like books on. Watermelon chewing. Yes, exactly. Like we would be up in arms about that. And I walked out of there saying, like, you know what this section for her is? The whole goddamn fucking store. And I was just like ranting about it. But it's that too. It's to be careful. When you're looking at that kind of stuff, because it might have seemed perfectly innocent to Chapters, but it just felt so insulting, especially since it's the only store I like shopping at.
I think I'm going to allow a brief audience response on this one too.
I hope I'm not stepping in, because after all, it is a comment. I'm a grandmother. I was lucky enough to have 2 daughters. Yay, daughters. I personally worked hard at making sure their toys were gender specific. In other words, they were built for people. The heck with, I would rather have gotten my daughters building toys than any doll in the world. Guess what my mother gave them, and guess what they wanted to play with. Now I have grandchildren, and the same thing's happening. BZ is correct. Get a variety of toys and let the children choose them. And if you've got budding anthropologists, budding archaeologists, engineers, they'll show up. And it doesn't matter whether they've got dangly bits or not. Let them grow up to be children and to become adults and whole. And yeah, I did push towards the sciences, and guess what? It didn't work. They are very successful. They are both managers in very big companies. One is a team leader, one is a senior accountant. I just wish I'd made an engineer.
Sorry, just one thing actually that I wanted to say with that. I was on Facebook before, and I had a friend who is pregnant, and her way of announcing what gender child she had was by saying, "I guess we'll be buying microscopes and balls and blocks." And I'm like, "Oh, so you're having a girl then?" Jeez.
I've had this idea of whenever anybody says, "Oh, it's a boy" or "It's a girl," just saying like, "Have they told you yet?" Like, they can't talk. You don't know. Come on.
I had just a quick little story about this because we had 4 girls first, and so I always said, we were in girl mode, and being in that cult where it was very, there were very distinct gender roles, etc. So then when we had a boy, we were like, what are we going to do with him? And but I found out, because when my boy was not quite 2, he was in the bathtub playing, and I went in and I noticed that all the toys in the bathtub were girly things, pink and purple and whatever. And he was playing with his sister's tea set. And so I was thinking, I should get some boy toys. But I sat down, and I was like, so what are you doing, having a tea party or a picnic? And he didn't answer me, but I'm watching him, and he had that teapot, and that was the captain of the soldiers. And the spout, the spout was the sword, and he's stabbing all the little teacups. So, I mean, it doesn't really make that much difference. They're going to do what they're going to do with it.
Sorry, that's hilarious. The deadly teapot.
Okay, I'm sure you remember from a few weeks ago the whole Snow White and the Huntsman bit from that one idiot editor down in Niagara Falls. Now, one thing that came up actually was published in the Toronto Star about a week after that, was this same guy had actually got in the news back in July for similar stupid comments. In that case, it was that he was complaining that the NHL was promoting homosexuality because he was talking about the You Can Play project by the Burke family, which in turn was in memoriam of Brendan Burke, who was a gay hockey player, Brian Burke, his father, being general manager of the Maple Leafs. And this guy had basically been complaining about this You Can Play project, which was designed to counter the sort of casual homophobia in the locker room that occurs in a lot of places. So they actively went out and they got a lot of hockey players to record statements, swearing that they would not use homophobic slurs in the locker room and that they would try to call out other people who were doing that. And this guy was complaining about. But I was more interested in what you were thinking about, that sort of low-level, get people to call out other people who are doing things, bigoted things and that sort of thing. What do you think about that sort of approach?
I find that call-outs can often not really be all that effective an approach, especially when it's being done by the person in the position of privilege, allegedly on behalf of the oppressed minority. Recently, excuse me, I don't know if you know about how, Roseanne Barr, is that her name? Yeah, she was like running for president for on the Green Party ticket. And she recently started saying some incredibly transphobic things on her Twitter and allying herself with some extremely transphobe TERF feminists. And it was sort of it was insulting and icky, and I hate when feminist icons do that. But there were a lot of people, cis people, who are sort of calling her out on her transphobia. And some of these people were using misogynistic insults and slurs like the C word, saying that she's a dried up, you transphobic. And that was sort of what they considered the appropriate response. I thought it was really weird that some cis men would think that trans women would appreciate misogynistic insults on our behalf. It was a little, backwards. And I find that that's just sort of a really obvious example of how call-out culture can end up going. I don't think it is very constructive. I think that it's often just an excuse for bullying and dogpiling and things like that. And that's sort of okay if you are the minority in question, because, sometimes you get angry, and sometimes the right to own your anger and make your own decisions about strategy sort of supersedes other things. And sort of saying you can respond to transphobia or racism or misogyny, but you have to be nice about it. That's sort of called tone trolling, and it's a really insulting thing, which itself can make people even more angry. But if you're not the person who's being directly affected, then just sort of assuming the right to start getting really angry and destructive, and that can just make the situation a whole lot worse and can sort of entrench a lot of bitterness. So yeah, I've just come to, I haven't really fully formed my ideas on this, but I just have a lot of distrust for social justice call-out culture.
Well, one other thing too, just sort of from a psychology perspective of things, I had a class where actually the professor pointed out that one of the most successful ways of actually affecting change was to temper fear with comedy. So that, for example, one of the most effective campaigns in favor of contraceptive use and condom use in order to prevent the spread of STIs was ones that were funny, but also ever so slightly scary. So like there was this one condom ad about like the screaming baby that the father had to wheel around the store, and it ends up with like, should have used a condom. And see, but the funny things, those kinds of commercials end up working. And how many of you have seen that Dumb Ways to Die video? And I actually want to see a show of hands. How many people have actually seen that video? Okay, for those of you who haven't seen it, it's this really fun song about dumb ways to die, and it's used as a Metro PSA ad used to encourage people not to play on the tracks, try to run across the platforms and get hit by trains and subways and etc. And I saw that and I thought it was brilliant because it's one of those things that sticks in people's heads. People show each other because it's funny, but it has a really important message. And it's sort of the same kind of idea of trying to figure out a way to do that sort of with feminist, trans, gay, etc. issues, is to sort of temper the really need for saying, okay, no, we need to affect this change, but also make it fun so that people want to share it. And it's really hard to come up with. I know I haven't yet. But like one thing, and I will say that there are a lot of problems with Dan Savage. I do agree with you there. But there's one thing that he says that I actually find kind of really amusing, where whenever he starts to call someone a pussy, he stops and says, you know what, actually, pussies are tough. Have you seen the kind of beating that they take and they bounce back? Fuck it, he's a ball sack. And that's what he decided, because ball sacks, they can't take a lot of damage very easily. And it was sort of his way of sort of trying to flip that around and change, that concept of, something classically considered as feminine, although not necessarily. Men can have pussies too. As turning it around, that negative stereotype about it, and sort of making it funny. Is he perfectly right in doing that? Not necessarily, but it's sort of an idea of what can work.
My question might be a little too close to that, but I'm going to ask it anyway. No. People like, and I'm going to name names because I haven't heard them yet this weekend, Rebecca Watson, Jennifer McCreight, other women's voices who have been silenced by a lot of very harsh commentary, women who have come out of very strong patriarchal cultures, I expect probably receive much of that same thing. Does the panel have any comments on how a man can respond against those kind of comments without coming off as an aggressive protector coming to the defense of a victim?
The first question would be to ask whether they need you to. Sometimes. Yeah, but I'm one of them and I get it. I know you do. Do you want to come up, actually? You could answer it if you want. This is Ophelia Benson. She gets them all the time. It's really messed up.
I honestly had a really hard time deciding who to put on this panel. It's like, there's too many people who be perfect.
Have a seat. Okay, thanks. Yeah, speaking as someone who's just right up there with Rebecca and Jen for getting this stuff, you need counterbalancing stuff. Maybe that sounds pathetic, but when it's going on day in and day out, you do need to hear stuff coming from the other direction. So I say, yeah, we do need it.
But what can we do so that it's not, again, like the aggressive protector
Go ahead. I'll think about that.
What I just mean by whether they need you to or not is that sometimes there can be assuming that when it's not necessarily been stated, and that what you can end up with is a whole plethora of male voices in the commentariat, sort of duking out and having their own little fight for supremacy of the comment thread of the blog online. It can end up really pushing down the female voices, and sometimes there's female commenters who want to get in there and say what's being done wrong. And sort of that's just sort of the extent of what I meant is just that question of whether you're pushing out the voices of the people who are being hurt by this and making things worse. That's sort of all I was getting at. I don't have an answer though. And that's Hina, who's on Skeptic, and she also gets it. Yeah, you can have a chair.
She still says stuff. I would summarize it as have my back. Don't get in front of me and yell for me. Don't stand off to the side and not help me. Have my back. And if more men were to do that, I think I would go to a lot more skeptical events. Although, it's happening more and more. But yeah, have my back. That's what I would say.
I was going to say the same thing. I was going to say, don't take the approach, sit back, little lady, I'll take care of this. That just doesn't work. That's not the right approach, but, to respect the struggle and say, agree that, yeah, that's horrible what that person is doing. I think that person's contemptible, but you're doing a fine job of battling them.
No, just stay.
Actually, my question is a perfect segue, I think. I had to write it down because I wanted to try to paraphrase this as much as I could. I've been kind of following some of that, the controversy over the past 2 years. And on small occasion, I've joined in on the Skeptic and Free Thought blog forums, in the mess that can happen in there. And I'm of the, I'm a strong supporter of from their perspective, from their point of view. And I kind of wanted to paraphrase what I was saying. That one of my opinions was I wished that there was a lot more, like what you guys are doing right now, like a lot more education and information and conversation, importantly. And one of the things I don't like is when people boycott. Like, for example, like TAM, if you look at last year at TAM, there was like 3,000 people. This year there was like 1,200 or something like that. And it was a severe decline of people. And I'm going to actually assume, I don't know if it's true or not, I'm going to assume it's because of those people that were boycotting or trying to put down. Oh, wait, let me get to the question though.
I know, getting ready to respond. I have something I want to say.
Okay, and this is actually one of the, I'm trying to paraphrase, one of the answers I was getting on the forums. Somebody said, well, and that's all I did. I didn't state a strong opinion against one side or the other. I just was hoping for more conversation. And then somebody wrote something along the line of, well, you're obviously a well-off white male who's never been victimized, so you have no voice in this discussion, right? And that got many comments liking that comment against me. And I was like, I'm not taking a side. I'm trying to join in on the conversation, right? So maybe my perspective felt like, I got victimized trying to help out against the conversation of being victimized. You know what I mean?
I do.
This is what so my question is kind of, I wonder if that's an aspect of protest culture as opposed to teaching and education culture. There's lots of activists in the community, but then there's also professors and teachers and people who aren't so outspoken. Do you see that as a big problem with the issues you're talking about?
Can I actually ask you a question just to start off? Were you here for Ian Cromwell's talk in the panel afterwards?
Yeah.
Did you hear the question somebody else asked about what can we do to unlock sort of the communities? Yeah, but it was right after, or it was after Krista Kahlo, but it tied in. It's kind of funny because it kind of ties back to that to some extent too. And I've been guilty of this too. And one of my biggest regrets was actually my reaction to when Rebecca Watson said, hey, let's boycott everything Richard Dawkins write. And I didn't stop to think about why she was writing that. Mm-hmm. And, I said, oh, well, she's right in everything that she's saying, but do we really need to boycott? And looking back now, I realize it comes to that same thing that Ian was saying before. When you've been discriminated and when you've been oppressed by a group for so long, it's hard to trust them enough to put yourself out there. And one of the things and I've never been to TAM, and I want to go someday, but one of the things that I was seeing was these women who were coming out and saying, you know what, I've been made to feel uncomfortable, and we're hoping we could get a discussion going. But the reaction was, no, bad feminists, don't talk about this, how dare you do this, you're scaring people away. And then there's that thought, well, shit, if they're gonna react like that, then I'm not going. Because why would I put my trust in somebody who's reacting that way? And it's that kind of thing. You're not going to put yourself at risk when you're getting that kind of reaction. And if your trust has been violated, you're not going to put yourself up there either. And so, it's an easy trap to fall into, is to try to say, oh, well, we should be more about education, it should be more about that. But sometimes when the education isn't being heard, when your voices aren't being heard, you need to do something drastic in order to make people start taking a look at it. And yeah, maybe the pushback at first is going to be something something bad, but hopefully eventually it'll get people starting to ask questions. One thing to look at is we have a lot of really amazing women speakers at this conference. Hey, look at that. It's not actually that hard to get a lot of amazing women speakers. It's sort of like, may or may not have been one of the plans of this conference. No. But it's sort of this idea of, spend less time trying to defend yourself and spend more time trying to listen. And then you'll find we have a lot more to say. Because the moment we know that somebody's going to listen to what we're trying to say, I don't think anybody particularly wants to be like, no, boycott everything. Because I shouldn't speak for other people, because maybe there are people who want to do that. But for me, I'd much rather have it be inclusive and be able to go to TAM and feel safe than end up in a situation where I have to consider, do I really want to be going to this kind of thing where something might happen to me and no one's going to believe me?
But the trolls that do the rape comments, like the attacks on the forums, I wonder how many of those people actually went to TAM.
You know what?
I bet you it's like near to none.
But right? Even with the Rebecca Watson thing, she had people outright say that they were going to corner her in elevators and do stuff to her, and that wasn't taken seriously. And and it's like, oh well, it's the internet. Nobody says important things on the nobody says important things on the internet. You know what? A lot of stalking takes place on the internet, and there's some really fucked up shit that happens on the internet, and it needs to be taken seriously, because when people are trying to call out that there's a problem, you need to fucking listen. And if we can't get you to listen, we're just going to stop showing up, and won't your movement be sadder for it? And it's kind of that. And yeah, it can really hurt when people start turning around on you and saying you're white, cis, privileged, whatever. And I've been there. I'm white and I'm cis, and I've been called white and cis privileged. And the moment where I find, for me, it started getting to the point where I was able to actually start learning about the issues was the moment I stepped back and said, you know what? Yeah, I am. I am white. I am cis. And I have a lot of privilege. And maybe I should start letting the people who don't tell me what to think instead of telling them what they should think.
Just thinking about how you were phrasing some of the aspects of your question can actually imply some of the problematic biases that are involved. For instance, you were talking about, I don't have a side here. But at the same time, not having a side is often sort of a luxury that not everybody gets. For instance, if you're the one receiving the rape threats and being called, anatomical slurs, those sort of things that it's not an extremist position to be freaked out by that. That's a very completely understandable response. And then when you have somebody who's not affected by those terms coming and saying, hey, can you cool it down? You seem a little bit angry about being called a cunt. That is, like I was saying about tone trolling, it makes people even more angry and absolutely have a right to that anger. So just, I think that when you do this, yes, it's really, really hard to not get defensive when you're called out on privilege, because none of us want to feel like our positions and luxuries and benefits in life are unearned. There's a very, very strong cognitive bias to feel like I've earned everything good in my life, and everything good that other people have that I don't, that was unfair. But everything bad that happens to somebody else was their own fault. but everything bad that happens to me was just bad luck. We all sort of just skew in that direction cognitively. And to be confronted with privilege is to go against that whole lifetime of psychological buildup to maintain these sort of comfortable ideas of ourselves. So yeah, I get that it's a very scary, challenging, confrontational thing, but that doesn't mean that it's not accurate.
Yeah, and about the phrasing too. That's like she says. That's a really kind of a triggering sort of thing. Like one thing I noticed right away is you said this was a controversy. This is the same thing creationists tell us, that there's a controversy. And no, there is no controversy. Creationists are idiots, and they're wrong. And in this situation, the MRAs and the ranting assholes are assholes, period. And there's you know, when you come into that kind of situation, you say there's a controversy here. No, there isn't. You know, reasonable people will look at this and see, well, there's one side that's doing some pretty odious things, and here's this other side which is just trying to defend themselves against these slurs. And there's no argument there. And then, of course, I also have to correct you on some factual things. There was no boycott call. That Rebecca Watson, for instance, did not call for a boycott of.
No, I didn't mean her.
Yeah, and nobody that I know of called for a boycott of TAM. What we had was individuals who said, you know, this meeting isn't for me. It's abusive. There's threats. The organizers are not respecting my desires, and they said, I'm not going to go. That's the way it's got to be. You can't tell Ophelia, oh, you have to go to TAM because why?
And also, I was thinking about the drop in attendance of TAM. Well, for one thing, there was not much of a widespread organized boycott. What there was a lot of women vocalizing how they've been treated at TAM and saying, yes, I was sexually harassed and DJ Grott didn't take it seriously. And I told the security guard and then he was ignored. Like, that kind of thing was talked about. And yeah, maybe that did have an impact on attendance, but it bloody should. Yeah. And we shouldn't bury that information.
Right. And you know, another factor here too is, as has been mentioned, you can have very talented women who are speaking at these events. And when Rebecca Watson says she's not going to go, I don't care whether you like her or not. She is a draw. She's an interesting person, a good speaker. She's entertaining, and she draws out controversy, and she gets discussions going. She's a real positive influence. And so when you say Rebecca Watson's not going, attendance will drop. When you say Ophelia Benson is not going, attendance will drop. And you can't say, well, you know, you can't blame that on the women who say it's not my kind of meeting, so I'm not going to go.
Sorry, this is just no. Sorry, this made me laugh because I just remembered this. Sorry, I just remembered this because it was you speaking, but we actually had people post on the Facebook page for Eschaton, and in case people don't know, I'm actually one of the people who helped organize Eschaton. We had people comment on the Facebook page that if that feminazi PZ Myers is going to be there, I'm not going to show up. I know, it was fantastic. And it was just like, okay, sure. If you know what, if that's your comment, we don't want you there. And I actually tweeted that at somebody. I'm like, you know what? Awesome. Don't come. We don't want you there.
Okay,
got
we have 5
by
minutes
Eschaton
left.
too.
We have 5 minutes left, so let's please try to wrap up.
Okay. I was going to make a joke.
Go ahead. Make the joke. That's important.
You managed to get called a feminazi without taking a single estradiol tablet.
So first, thanks for this discussion. I think it's very important. Slow clap, eh? And so I'm sympathetic to many of the concerns, and I think a lot of the established roles that we have are mainly cultural. But I think also at a Science and Skeptics conference, we can say there are some biological differences between, and maybe the best way to say it is, the vast majority of people who would self-identify as male and the vast majority of people who identify as female. And I'm trying to think about why that may be in certain ways. I guess the perhaps provocative question for the panel is, for tens and thousands of years, these two groups, on average, men have been stronger physically than women. What if it was switched? That's the question.
Well, the what if it's switched part, I'm not quite sure about that. I probably think that we'd probably have a matriarchy in some respects, but I think there's lots of other anatomical aspects that need to be taken into consideration. But mainly, I was reading a lot of research recently on gender differentiation and segregation in sports. There's sort of this common sense idea that it's utterly impossible to get women and men to play on the same teams in sports because men will have this anatomical advantage. But actual studies of the actual science find that in a lot of situations, when we're talking about the top 10% elite athletes, those differences that supposedly exist between male muscle mass and female muscle mass, or center of gravity in women versus center of gravity in men, there's a ceiling there. And that those gender differences aren't nearly as strong as we tend to claim when trying to make the argument that, for instance, trans women should not be allowed to play on women's teams because they'll have an unnatural advantage. So I think, first of all, like the anatomical advantages between those who are sexed male and those who are sexed female, they're not consistent. There's a whole lot of different anatomical differences. There can be secondary sex, chromosomal sex, hormonal sex, genital sex, skeletal sex, etc. They're not universal, and there's a bit of a cap when talking about certain high levels of aptitude. So I just get suspicious about how many assumptions we're making when we start talking about women as weaker than men and this being a scientifically verified fact or simple common sense. It really isn't.
Yeah, and I just have to bring up some evolution here because that's what I do. If you look at the history of our species, 30, 40,000 years ago, Europe was full of Neanderthals. And when you look at their skeletons, they were a real strong, masculine type of species. Even the women were stronger than our species. Big, bulky bones, huge muscles. These were people who fought mastodons with stone axes, okay? And it was those girly man Homo sapiens coming up out of Africa that replaced them. So you can't make simplistic assumptions that bigger, stronger, more testosterone loaded is a better way of surviving or puts you in a top position in a society. It's just not true. That our own history is a perfect example of intelligence and agility triumphing. And sorry, the ladies are just as good at that as we are.
As you know, I've studied biology and psychology, and one thing that I caution you is to make, again, those assumptions about biological essentialism, because what we find is a lot of what we think are actually, women usually act like this culturally and men usually act like that culturally. It's not actually the case if you remove social factors. And there is perhaps some things that are, and this is especially supported by, when we have people who are trans, where it's that sort of female brain idea, but a lot of stuff that we consider as being female roles are instituted by actual culture as opposed to actual biology. And again, making that assumption that culturally throughout the ages it's always been that way is also something that's not actually. I'm overgeneralizing your point. I do realize that, but it's a very dangerous claim to make as well, because if you look at some isolated cultures, the pre-Christian Celtic cultures were matrilineal. And the result of that was actually, in some ways, a much different social structure in which women were less oppressed to some extent. There were cultures that had female soldiers. We had, and things like that. So when you actually look at that, then this sort of culturally it's always been this way kind of argument really begins to fall apart. And especially when we look at stuff that happens pre-agriculture and pre that time period, we're seeing that this division of labor along gender lines may not have actually been the case, and that it may not have been that men were the hunters and women were the gatherers. I don't know if you saw the talk I did on evolution and polyamory at all.
No, I had a different event that day.
Okay, well, it's up on YouTube, so I recommend you watch it. But I actually talked about, no, but I talked about that idea as well. And I mean, to me, it seems counterintuitive that if you had a woman who was an amazing hunter, that you'd keep her as a gatherer, even though she was colorblind and couldn't tell the difference between the blueberry that kills you and the red berry that saves you. You know, that just seems to me like it would be counterintuitive. And when your tribe depends, its survival depends on everybody doing their task as well as possible, then keeping somebody from doing something just because of gender just seems like a really bad idea. And there is, I don't want to get too Evo psyche, but there is some sort of evidence to support this fact that it wasn't actually that clear of a division, and it's just not that clear of a division anyway. I'm better at building stuff than a lot of the guys I know. That's usually considered a classically male thing to do.
Just as a quick aside, the whole female brain and male body, or male brain and female body idea, that doesn't actually hold true very consistently either. It's also a bit. I don't know enough, so I was like we can say there's tiny little differences or tweaks that we might someday find a neurological origin for, like the lordosis behavior or same-sex attraction or things like that. But gender is this incredibly nuanced, complex social system of expressing those differences, was sort of the thing I was trying to get at.
It's important to remember, sorry, that biology and neurology can be affected by environment as well. So where, you know, there's this idea that, you know, people with these kinds of neural pathways or these kinds of neurotransmitters do better at certain things, and, you know, classically it's this kind of gender, but, you know, if you put them into a different kind of environment, then suddenly they develop more of that neurotransmitter or more of those neural pathways if you do it young enough. So even there, you know, I don't think the nature versus nurture. Funny how often it's not a binary thing comes up, but but it's very much, it's not a binary. Nature affects nurture and nurture affects nature. And that's something that is going to happen and something that we do see. So, yeah.
Okay, this concludes our panel. Thank you to PC Myers, Natalie Reid, Vyckie Garrison, Ania Bula,